Okay, so let's bring Vanessa on properly now. Now, Vanessa, right at the very beginning of the Ukraine conflict, we had the blowing up of the Antonov, the big Antonov aircraft, which was a major propaganda event at the time because it was the biggest aircraft on the entire planet. But another Antonov has hit the headlines, and well, Canada has just decided to steal it.
As somebody on Twitter alerted me to it as rules-based theft. So the headlines in, I can't remember where it is, the military something magazine,
Force
I
Index.
can't read it off the screen. Yeah, thank you. Prized Russian airliner delivering COVID supplies seized by Canada to be handed to Ukraine. Why AN-124s matter to Moscow, and then if we actually look at the report. So Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced on June the 10th that his government would seize a Russian-owned AN-124 heavyweight cargo aircraft, and that Ottawa would move towards forfeiting the aircraft to Ukraine. I mean, this is just extraordinary. The statement was made as Trudeau, whose government has been a leading supporter of the Ukrainian war effort since 2014. Interesting that they say since 2014. So are they accepting that the war started in 2014 with the US orchestrated coup? He made a surprise visit to Kiev. Owned by the Russian air carrier Volga Dnepr Airlines, the AN-124 aircraft in question had been chartered by the Canadian government and landed in Toronto on February the 27th, 2022, carrying rapid tests for COVID-19 from China. So effectively, it was on I guess you could call it a humanitarian mission. The seizure represents the latest by Western countries targeting Russian assets, with assets frozen by some estimates amounting to over 600 billion from both the state and private Russian firms and citizens. The bulk of these assets are expected to be appropriated by Western states, which will help to cover the costs of the Western world's tremendous investments in the Ukrainian war effort. So effectively what that means is they're stealing Russian equipment in order to pay for the war that they're waging against Russia in Ukraine.
Yes, incredible. Now let's move on to a disturbing story here. First of all, another propaganda piece. This is a little bit of video from the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office that they put out a couple of days ago. And it's pushing again this narrative that Russia is stealing children in Ukraine. Let's have a look at this.
Over 19,000 Ukrainian children have been taken from their families and homes by Russian forces. Many have been transported to a network of re-education camps. One camp identified is 3,900 miles from Ukraine in Russia's far east. Once there, they are subjected to a targeted pro-Russian re-education program aimed at destroying their Ukrainian identity. These children must be returned.
So that little piece of propaganda from the Foreign Office, the information for that came from the Yale School of Public Health in the United States. It was a report published in February of this year. It came under the auspices of the Humanitarian Research Lab at Yale School of Public Health and was part of the State Department-funded Conflict Observatory program. So there's nothing in that that can be seen as being objective or anything. But now, my first point here is that if we look, the story is these children are being taken out of Ukraine into re-education camps where they're having the culture re-educated out of them so they forget about their Ukrainian culture and become Russians. So let's contrast that with what Vladimir Saldo here, who's the Russian governor from the Russian government of Kherson, said just a couple of days ago. He's talking about language. He's saying that everyone has the right to free choice of language and communication, upbringing, culture, and art, safeguarding people's cultural, spiritual, and historical values. This was at the time that he was announcing that schools could consider 3 languages as being official languages, and they could choose which language they wanted to use. They could choose Russian for sure, but they could just as equally choose Ukrainian, and the other one was a Tatar language. Sorry. So is that a group or a country which is an oblast which is destroying Ukrainian culture? Well, no, absolutely not. And then we got to take this into account. The Russian Education Ministry announcing that students in the four newly joined regions, Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, can study Ukrainian in schools, either as their native language or as an additional course. Also, a new Ukrainian language textbook was produced for elementary school level. Again, is that the culture of Ukraine being squashed under Russian governorship?
Well, clearly, look, beyond this, Mike, the Gray Zone, Jeremy Lafredo, a journalist with the Gray Zone, debunked this idea that these children were being abducted. They were taken, many of the ones they're counting in that report you've cited from Yale, are being taken out of the conflict zones by their families to go to music school or kind of summer camp to avoid being in the firing line.
Right, precisely.
And so it's been totally debunked. So just beyond the broader cultural issue that you're talking about, the linguistic issue,
right?
There's no credibility at all in these accusations.
So on one hand, the West is alleging that Russia is stealing children to educate them. On the other hand, the Russians are alleging that the Ukrainians are stealing children to steal their organs. And this is from TASS. Ukraine ready to pay West in people's organs for military assistance. And that's the Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, Maria Zakharova, talking about this. Now, my first question was, well, is there any evidence, in fact, that Ukraine has been involved in organ trafficking over the years? And actually, we can go back many, many years on this. So this is the European Court of Human Rights, effectively, saying the case of the missing children, lost babies and corpses without organs fuel allegations of trafficking in body parts in Ukraine. That was published 14 years ago. This has been going on for decades in Ukraine. So Vanessa, but this is a problem that happens in war zones, and the same type of situation has happened in Syria and Libya.
Right, not only in Syria and Libya, and it's known as the red market. It's known as one of the most lucrative harvests of war. And of course, going back to Kosovo, Pristina, 1999, when the KLA, Albanian warlords, and Al-Qaeda were cross-border trafficking predominantly Serbs and predominantly children. And the same elements who were involved then are setting up organizations that are backing the Ukrainians in Kiev. And also, Mike, I just want to say, when I was in Russia to go to Donbass to observe the referendum, I went to the east of Russia and I went to the various areas that were basically converted into holiday camps, let's say. They were previously holiday camps, and they were set up as housing for the children and families coming in as refugees from the war in Eastern Ukraine, then became obviously reunified with Russia. And I have to say, the care for these children was extraordinary. They were given 3 meals a day. They were fast-tracked into citizenship if they wanted it. Their culture was being respected through the education they were being given. They were offered ongoing psychological support for the trauma they suffered. And you have to remember that actually who was trying to prevent them speaking Russian was Kiev. Basically, the Russian language was being eradicated from school. So who was eradicating their culture in Ukraine? It was Kiev, with NATO backing. The hypocrisy on this is absolutely insane. As I said, I went to the majority of the cities and towns in Eastern Russia that welcomed thousands of refugees from Mariupol and from Donbass. So I saw firsthand how these children and families were being treated. It blows my mind. It reminds me of the stories coming out of Aleppo when I was standing on the streets of Aleppo, and you had Owen Jones saying that Syrian Arab Army were raping women and children and so on and so forth. And I'm standing there in the streets and nothing is happening. If anything, the Syrian army soldiers are being welcomed with open arms because their families are in the areas that they've just liberated. The inversion of reality in Western media, whenever there is a conflict that is being backed and funded and sponsored by the West, is extraordinary. It's criminal.
Yeah.
And a lot of this critical race theory, it's like critical race theory. It's coming from Western NGOs, Soros-funded NGOs in Ukraine. They've been doing it for decades.
Yes.
And that's what's created this. Ukrainians didn't naturally have these massive divisions, like how they tried to do in Syria, as well as Vanessa said, the West are constantly trying to divide and rule. They'd done that in Ukraine, and that sowed the seeds for this kind of animosity between these supposedly different ethnicities. But really, it's you could say this is a civil war
Yeah.
on many levels.